The maximum wage is a policy proposal aimed at narrowing the vast discrepancy in income inequality that exists in the world today. Why is this a problem that needs addressing? Income inequality has reached stratospheric proportions. In 2019, just 3 individuals in the United States earned as much as the bottom half of the country. Even neoliberals like Barack Obama have called inequality the defining challenge of our time. Pope Francis called it the root of societal evil, and Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus described global concentration of wealth as a ticking time bomb. But beyond these opinions from such different people, the wealth gap has real consequences on society and the planet. Study after study shows a diminishing rate of return on increases in wealth beyond a certain point, especially when that wealth is concentrated in a few hands. People live longer in more equitable countries, whereas countries with higher inequality suffer poorer health outcomes, from infant mortality rates to heart failure. What's more, the consumption patterns of the ultra-wealthy far outpace the fair resource usage they should have relative to the population. Disproportionate wealth also gives the ultra-wealthy disproportional influence in the formation of policy, creating a vicious cycle as tax legislation heavily favoring the ultra-wealthy is passed without much effort in the name of trickle-down economics. And yet, despite their lifestyles and political influence, the ultra-wealthy are no happier for it. Studies have indicated that people who live in more egalitarian societies are happier, and happiness does not increase with wealth beyond a certain point. In fact, Nobel Prize-winning economists Kahneman and Deaton estimate that above a yearly income of $75,000, people's happiness does not increase perceptibly. So, if everyone is worse off, and even the ultra-wealthy are no happier, implementing a maximum wage would seem to be a step in the right direction, not just towards closing wealth gaps, but to making everybody happier, right? But how to do it? One way is by implementing absolute pay caps, prohibiting salaries above a certain amount. In Brazil, for example, the maximum wage for public servants is based on the salary of Supreme Court judges and is adjusted yearly to inflation. That example, however, is the public sector. This may be a political third rail in the private sector, and those whose salaries are directly affected might recur to tax evasion or simply deploy their political power to overturn it altogether. Another method of achieving a maximum wage is through taxation. Simply tax incomes over a certain amount at 100%, or close to it. As we shall see in a moment, this has been the mechanism of choice when countries have tried to curb wealth discrepancies. Then we have the pay ratio. According to Sam Pizzigati, the author of the book, The Case for a Maximum Wage, this is the model around which most countries center on. Here, companies would be prohibited from paying their CEOs more than a certain ratio above their lowest paid employee's salary. This idea has the added benefit that it might give an incentive to raise the minimum wage. After all, the more the lowest paid make, the more the highest paid will make as well. This idea is gaining momentum, as we shall see in just a little bit. Recently, people from as different backgrounds as Robert Reich, Jeremy Corbyn, and Jesse Ventura have all proposed implementing a maximum wage. But is it feasible? Well, it turns out the idea isn't entirely new. As far back as the 1880s, Felix Adler, a German-born philosopher, founder of the ethical culture movement, and a crusader against child labor, proposed a 100% tax on income once a certain standard of living had been met. In his own words, he sought to tax away pomp, pride, and power. His proposal changed social discourse on income and wealth discrepancies for good. More than a half-century later, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt proposed a 100% tax on individual income over $25,000, the equivalent of just under $400,000 today. Eventually, a 94% tax for the wealthiest bracket was implemented and hovered around 90% over the next 2 decades, burgeoning the middle class of the United States. With the advent and spread of neoliberal trickle-down economic policy, income tax levels shrank significantly worldwide from the 1970s onward, one of the major causes for today's soaring wealth inequality. Recently, however, there have been signs of pushback against this disproportionate accumulation of wealth. In 2013, Switzerland held a referendum that would have limited corporate executive compensation to 12 times the lowest paid employee. In the 2017 French presidential elections, Jean-Luc Mélenchon proposed capping annual wages at €400,000. Two U.S. cities, Portland and San Francisco, have passed legislation that increase taxes on companies whose wage discrepancies exceed a certain level. As of 2018, Portland levies a 10% surtax on companies who pay their executives more than 100 times their median wage, increasing proportionally as the gap increases. San Francisco recently approved the overpaid executive tax, which is very similar to Portland's measure. Meanwhile, on the national level, legislation introduced in the Senate would levy a tax on wealth over $50 million, while another bill introduced in the House of Representatives would tax companies with major wage discrepancies, similar to Portland and San Francisco. It should be noted that, while these proposals to tax companies' income based on excessive ratios are a good start, they are inherently flawed in that they fix the ratio based on a company's median income, not its lowest income. Whether through taxation, pay caps, or pay ratios, the possible positive effects of a maximum wage are worthy of consideration. Some estimate it would curb consumption patterns by the ultra-wealthy if their income no longer supports frivolous excesses. After all, non-financial assets such as mansions, yachts, jets, or expensive art do not generate income, but rather cost money to maintain, staff, and insure. If this reduction in consumption habits comes to pass, we might also see a reduction in natural resource use by humans, as there is a strong correlation between inequality and environmental degradation. Studies done in India showed that government programs aiming to curb environmental damage tend to fail more frequently when there is more inequality and deteriorated environmental conditions, and succeed more often when regulatory and environmental conditions are better. Since those most affected by a maximum wage would be the wealthiest in society, the economic activities most likely to decrease would be in real estate and financial sectors. Degrowth in real estate has a net positive environmental effect, since it decreases resource throughput. Meanwhile, less excess money in the financial sector might curb speculative investment in environmentally damaging projects. It would be worthwhile analyzing further if any other sectors might be affected with negative consequences. Also, in order to ensure maximum effectiveness, a maximum wage should be considered in conjunction with other policies. Further analysis is needed to determine which ones, but they might include a minimum wage for one. If the goal is to close the wealth gap, a maximum wage doesn't make sense without also implementing a minimum wage. Importantly, as we mentioned earlier, if a maximum wage is tied to a minimum wage, the lower band is more likely to be increased, greatly benefiting more people. Two important policies that should be considered in conjunction with a maximum wage are a universal basic income and job guarantees. These would help to soften the economic blow of any job losses caused by a decrease in the ultra-wealthy's spending habits. Of course, greater income distribution would also likely stimulate job creation as the lower income groups are able to spend more. Just what kind of growth is created is of concern within a degrowth context, however. Increased spending on frivolous items would be detrimental to environmental impact. Thus, a heavy tax on advertising may also be considered. According to one recent study, in a hypothetical more equal society, energy usage would shift from frivolous transportation and luxury items. It predicted that an income distribution closer to that of Scandinavian countries would shrink energy demand from transportation by 30%, more than offsetting an increase in residential energy use. Any taxes levied on wealth or excessive incomes should be redistributed back through social programs such as healthcare, education, public transportation, or even reparations. All of these policies have social benefits, reduce individual expenditures in them, and would serve to reduce inequality overall. Two major concerns expressed with the implementation of a maximum wage are talent flight and wealth flight. Regarding talent flight, professor and author Mark Reif asks, do we really think a CEO who gets paid $100 million works any harder than one who gets paid $50 million or $10 million? Once pay is high enough to incentivize maximum effort, extra compensation does nothing. In any case, this issue could be addressed through international collaboration on whichever maximum wage mechanism or combination of policies is enacted, be they wage caps, taxation, or a combination of both. If overall wealth is capped in one country, the theory goes, people will move to a different country where they can continue accumulating wealth indefinitely. This could be controlled by an exit tax, such as the one the US already has, in which global wealth and assets are taxed at a 90% rate upon leaving the country and renouncing citizenship. In order to address both talent and wealth flight, international cooperation will be required. Without some coherence to policy and without truly effective mechanisms to eliminate financial havens and account for wealth and assets, such measures may be undermined. Some people argue that capping or limiting wages will negatively affect innovation. However, innovations in energy conservation or sustainable modeling, the kind of innovations we most urgently need, tend to emerge from small businesses whose salary levels are not the drivers of divergent salary structures. Human beings generally understand excesses are bad and impose limits on certain behaviors in the name of safety and civility. There are limits to the speed you can drive down the highway. There are limitations to where you can smoke cigarettes. There is currently a global effort afoot to limit carbon emissions. And during the COVID pandemic, self-imposed limits have been placed on any number of activities in the name of preserving the species. In other words, as a society, we try to limit potentially damaging behavior. Should wealth accumulation be any different? Why should it be exempt from limits, especially considering the social and environmental problems that come from disproportionate wealth distribution? Humans also harbor an inherent sense of fairness. Yet, by all accounts, we are in another gilded age when a tiny minority can live in opulence while more than half the world population finds itself struggling to make ends meet. This does not fit with anybody's sense of fairness, and we really have to ask ourselves, is this the kind of world we want to live in? The easiest first step we can take towards restoring some sense of justice is by repairing wealth discrepancies where they begin, with wages. The time for a maximum wage is now. The